right. Again, welcome to the webinar series for Psychiatry Redefined, everyone. Tonight, we're very happy to have with us Dr. Tim Brewerton, and he's going to be giving us a little sneak peek into an incredibly fascinating case study that he has in dissociative identity disorder. All right. For those of you that don't know Dr. Brewerton, he's an experienced clinician, researcher, teacher, mentor, writer, editor, and advocate, as well as a recognized leader in the eating disorders field. He's currently affiliate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, where he has a private practice. Dr. Brewerton also serves as the director of clinical outcomes and research for Montanito and affiliates, as well as senior clinical advisor for Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight programs. He is a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, Distinguished Fellow of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Founding Fellow of the Academy of Eating Disorders and the Eating Disorders Research Society, and former president of EDRS and the South Carolina Psychiatric Association. He's achieved board certifications in general, child and adolescent, and forensic psychiatry, as well as addiction medicine. Please welcome Dr. Brewerton.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's a real pleasure. I also want to thank James Greenblatt and Psychiatry Redefined for allowing me this opportunity to present this webinar to you tonight. My primary purpose is to tell you about the course that I developed over the last 30 plus years that started with my first case of dissociative identity disorder, which was then, of course, called multiple personality disorder. And this was in February of 1988, shortly after I came to the Medical University of South Carolina to start its first eating disorder program. Sylvia was referred to me by her family medicine doctor for depression, binge eating, obesity, and impending diabetes mellitus. And I began to evaluate her and treat her for her depression and binge eating. Started her on Prozac and began to do cognitive behavioral therapy. And in the course, I describe how in detail I stumbled upon the realization in the third or fourth session that she had dissociative identity disorder. I continued to treat her for over 4 years. This is very much a personal story as well, because it really deeply inspired me to pursue research in the role of trauma and eating disorders. During the 5-hour course, which has 5 CMEs or 5 CEUs or 5 CNEs, there are 80 minutes of video clips from various stages during treatment with Sylvia, starting in the late 80s. And I illustrate the dissociative process and the various alters that were identified. She had 7 of them. I illustrate how these alters take on specific adaptive functions and separate identities which protect the self and are often archetypal in nature. You will observe, if you take this course, as I connect with Sylvia's different alters, as she processes her extensive childhood traumas, and you will have a rare opportunity to observe the unfolding process of her full integration. Notably, one of the alters in her case engaged in severe binge eating and purposeful weight gain as a form of soothing and self-protection. Evolving concepts from psychotherapy theory and practice, epidemiology, and neuroscience are highlighted during the presentation that establish dissociative identity disorder as a validated, trauma-based, and very treatable psychiatric disorder. I want you to know that this presentation, this course, is being done with the complete and written informed consent of Sylvia, who is now deceased. The learning objectives are to go over and understand the historical development of the concept of dissociation, MPD, DID, and other dissociative disorders, to compare the adaptive functions of the various alters that are identified and described in this case presentation, to list the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for DID, to describe the modern neurobiological findings that support the validity of DID, and to identify and describe the 3 major phases of treatment of DID, which I will somewhat about tonight. This is the course outline, starting off with some of my own personal reflections and what I brought to the table at that point in my life and in my career in terms of professional development and evolution. And also the context of the state of psychiatry in the field at that time. As I mentioned, I'll talk about the nature and history of dissociation and its disorders, go over the criteria, how that's evolved over the years. And I will talk about how neurobiology meets psychoanalytic thinking and theory. We'll go into depth the case, and you'll see, again, these video clips in the course of treatment. and you'll see these clips that demonstrate the process of full integration. If you've never had a case of DID, or if you've never really seen this unfold, it's absolutely phenomenal, and it still amazes me to this day, over 30 years. We'll talk about the archetypal aspects of these different alters or ego states or parts, self parts, and discuss the case as we go along. We'll talk about the prevalence of dissociative disorders, the clinical and neuroscience research at the time, as well as how it's evolved subsequently. Talk about the general principles in the treatment of DID, as well as the benefits of working with this group of patients. This level of instruction is, I would say, intermediate, but it is appropriate for all levels. But one should know that some of the information contained in the course is about child maltreatment, which may be triggering to some. But in my opinion, it has marked educational value because the benefits far outweigh the risk in that Sylvia reached full integration and recovery. And I think also, if you're practicing in mental health today, particularly psychiatry, psychology, it's unavoidable to, not deal with child maltreatment. So this is for all mental health and professionals in medicine, whether you're psychiatrists, pediatricians, other physicians, psychologists, social workers, counselors, nurses, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, dietitians, because it's relevant to eating disorders. And students of all mental health disciplines, especially those who work with patients or clients with eating and or other psychiatric disorders. In addition, it's also of interest to laypersons who are interested in the devastating effects of severe and early childhood. I'd like to pause and have you consider some of these questions, those of you who are out in the audience with me tonight. How many of you have seen a case of DID? How many of you think it doesn't exist or that it is rare? Are you a skeptic? How many of you think that DID is iatrogenic? How many of you were taught absolutely nothing about dissociative disorders in medical school, residency training, or fellowship training, or grad school? How many of you learned what you think you know about DID from movies or TV shows? For example, The Three Faces of Eve, Sybil, Psycho, The Exorcist, Fight Club, Identity, Split, The United States of Terror. There are any number of them, but they are all major misrepresentations in one way or another of the phenomenology of DID. How many of you may have treated patients with DID and not know it and miss the diagnosis? Because the research that I go over says that happens quite a bit. And how many of you actually do trauma-focused psychotherapy with your patient? Those are things I'd just like you to think about as we go forward. Now, going back to when I was in medical school, which was in 1974 to 78, so I'm revealing my age here, the Friedman, Kaplan, and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry was kind of the Bible of psychiatry at the time. And in that book at that time, in that edition published in 1976, it stated, quote unquote, that incest was very rare and did not occur more often than 1 in 1.1 million people. Obviously, that is not true, but that is what our field taught and believed back when I started doing this. I'm going to throw in another quote by Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher, who said that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. And I think child maltreatment, child abuse, incest is one of those topics in which we thought our people who believed in it and also in particular treated and diagnosed DID were ridiculed. And I certainly fell into that group at the time. We know, though, thanks to an explosion of research in the behavioral sciences and neurosciences, that child sexual abuse is a widespread problem. Every 9 minutes, Child Protective Services substantiates or finds evidence for a claim of child sexual abuse. And that's just the ones that are substantiated and that Child Protective Services knows about. And 1 in 9 girls and 1 in 53 boys under the age of 18 experience sexual abuse or assault by an adult. And 82% of all victims under 18 are female. Of all the victims under 18, 2 out of 3 are ages 12 to 17, but a third of them, 34%, or under age 12. It's the second most common age time of rape for women in this country. And child victims often know the perpetrator. We're talking 93% of the perpetrators are known to the victim, with a quarter of them being family members, 59% acquaintances, and only 7% are strangers. So I'd like to move on and talk a little bit about dissociative disorders and eating disorders. And again, dissociative disorders and their symptoms are related to overwhelming traumatic experiences, and particularly those during childhood, because the earlier they occur, the more we are developmentally prone to use dissociation as a defense. And dissociative symptoms may include derealization, depersonalization, time distortions, cognitive and memory alterations, including amnesia, identity alterations, and somatic sensation. And these are all things that the brain does, the mind-brain do. And we know that there are high frequencies of eating disorders and behaviors in patients with dissociative identity disorder, which is kind of the granddaddy of all related disorder. Frank Putnam, who I met when I was a medical staff fellow at the National Institute of Mental Health back in 1982 to 84 to 87, he was studying multiple personality disorder. He also stumbled upon when he was working on Bob Post's unit of the biological psychiatry branch unit in studying bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness. And he got very interested in it, and he collected 100 cases and made this report in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry in 1986. And this is just before I met Sylvia in February of 1988. And he's attempting to better delineate the clinical phenomenology of what was called, again, multiple personality disorder then. Here's what he found in terms of the symptomatology that was most commonly reported, with depression being by far at the top. Mood swings were common, suicidality, and so forth. Of course, psychogenic amnesia, which we now call dissociative amnesia. But you can see down where the arrows are that both anorexia and bulimia, and they're referring to anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, which we call it now. Those were very common symptoms in these first 100 cases that Putnam reported in 1986. We're talking about 25% with symptoms of anorexia and about 15% with symptoms of bulimia. So that caught my attention because I was researching eating disorders when I was at NIMH, and then came to the medical university, again, as I mentioned, in 1987 to start the first eating disorder program. Since that period, others have reported high frequencies of dissociation in patients with eating disorders, particularly those with bulimia nervosa, as well as in non-clinical samples with eating disorder pathology. And these include studies from Italy, Dali Grave and Palmisano are from Italy, and Brown is from Australia. So this is not just a United States phenomenon. Mark Dimitrak, who is a medical staff fellow with me, and Frank Putnam looked at dissociation in eating disorder patients and showed that high degrees of dissociation were related to self-mutilation and suicidal behavior. Other investigators, Moshe Torum was a psychiatrist in Akron, Ohio. He published about covert multiple personality underlying eating disorders, and how in this group of individuals with both conditions, the effectiveness of treatment was far from desired. Described a special subgroup of patients with an eating disorder whose underlying dynamics and psychopathology were due to multiple personality disorder. This is 1990. In 1992, Kim McCallum, she ended up founding McCallum Place and being a major player in the eating disorder field. Jim Locke, who went on to talk about family-based treatment of anorexia nervosa, Marcia Rorty, and others published this paper in Dissociation in 1992. And they studied 38 patients who were clinically identified with eating disorders and found that 29% of them had dissociative disorder. And in particular, multiple personality disorder and depersonalization disorder were 10% and 18% respectively, in this group. They found that when they looked, dissociative symptoms occurred very frequently and were temporally associated with the binge-purge cycle or severe restriction in about 3/4 of them, along with sexual behavior in 39% and self-harm in over a quarter. So again, they emphasized that dissociative symptoms are relevant to the behaviors that are characteristic of patients with eating disorders, and that they both needed to be addressed. Both of these issues needed to be addressed in terms of treatment outcome. And then we have in 1993 a paper by Andrew Levin and colleagues in the International Journal, again noting how little work had been done on the sequelae of child trauma and eating disorders, and that uncovering multiple personality disorder was critical in the treatment, the cases that they were describing, 2 women who presented for inpatient treatment of eating disorders who were subsequently found to have multiple personality disorder. So this issue appeared in the literature here and there very early on, and around the time that I was about to meet Sylvia and had met Sylvia, and of course influenced me. And so I again began to do more research in this area. I teamed up with the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center group with Dean Kilpatrick, Bonnie Dansky, Pat O'Neill, and questions added to the third wave of the National Women's Study. And we published in '99 a paper showing how bulimia nervosa subjects had significantly more psychogenic amnesia or forgetting of traumatic events, 27% compared to 12% in binge eating disorder and 11% in non-eating disorder subjects. Basically, those who endorse that they forgot all or part of prior traumatic events. This just shows a graphic representation of these data. So dissociative amnesia, psychogenic amnesia, is very common in people with binging and purging. And we did a multiple linear regression using psychogenic amnesia as the dependent variable, and we identified a number of significant variables that predicted it, starting at the top in decreasing order of significance: lifetime PTSD, childhood rape, lifetime major depression, molestation, emotional problems in the family, laxative abuse, and you see vomiting down below it, and the trauma dose, the total number of victimization experiences, and age. Basically, the earlier the age, the more likely to have this dissociative symptom. So this really pointed the fingers at purging behaviors, particularly vomiting and laxatives, more so than binge eating, as maladaptive behaviors linked to child sexual abuse, PTSD, and depression, that we hypothesized facilitated avoiding, numbing, and forgetting traumatic memories. I want to remind people who know the history of psychiatry that Breuer and Freud made this observation in the late 19th century in their paper on the psychical mechanism of hysterical phenomena. The symptoms which we have been able to trace back to precipitating factors of this sort. And they're talking about the seduction hypothesis. They're talking about childhood sexual abuse. Those symptoms include neuralgias, anesthesias of very various kinds, many of which have persisted for years, contractures, paralyses, hysterical attacks, epileptoid convulsions, and so on. But chronic vomiting and anorexia were noted by Breuer and Freud, carried to the pitch of rejection of all nourishment. So this major disturbance in eating, particularly the purging and restriction, were noted in association with childhood sexual abuse by these early investigators. Fast forward to 2021. This is a paper that just came out this year in the Journal of Psychiatric Research from Harvard and McLean Hospital on post-traumatic cognitions predict distorted body perceptions in women with DID. So this has become a bona fide area of research, and there is an enormous amount of research that has gone on, and a lot of this I will cover in my course. In this paper, reiterate how DID is a psychobiological syndrome associated with a history of exposure to childhood abuse and neglect. And they document the occurrence of distorted body perceptions in DID and examine the role of child maltreatment, PTSD symptoms and severity, and post-traumatic cognitions as predictors of these distorted body perceptions. They find that elevated levels of weight phobia body image concerns, body avoidance, compulsive self-monitoring, and depersonalization in DID were present in those with eating disorders. Distorted body perceptions were elevated. And when you controlled for child maltreatment and PTSD severity, these findings didn't change. And so they noted that distorted cognitions are a key target for therapeutic intervention. So again, it really helps substantiate the hypothesis that one needs to deliver integrated care and not just treat one or the other symptom, just treat the eating disorder or just treat the trauma. They both need to be concurrently addressed. This is a very important and useful paper. If those of you who want to read more, I highly recommend this paper, and I give it to a lot of people who want to know more about DID. It's by Bethany Brand, professor of psychology at the University of Maryland in Towson, published in the Harvard Review of Psychiatry. She talks about six myths, and separating the fact from the fiction, starting with the belief that DID is a fad, that DID is primarily diagnosed in North America only by DID experts who overdiagnose it. The myth that DID is rare. I've heard that one, all of my life. It's not true. The belief that DID is an iatrogenic disorder rather than a trauma-based disorder. The belief that DID is the same entity as borderline personality disorder. I've run across a lot of psychiatrists like that. They refuse to diagnose DID, even though it's, very evident. The symptoms are very distinct. It's not the same symptomatology as borderline personality disorder, but they will not make that diagnosis, and they will give them a BPD diagnosis instead. The idea or the myth that DID treatment is harmful to patients. None of these are true, and Bethany and her colleagues in this paper do a great job debunking all of these myths. DID has been described in the literature literally for hundreds of years. It's been reliably and validly diagnosed with structured and semi-structured interviews. It's been diagnosed in clinical settings where structured interviews may not be available or practical. It's been identified in outpatient, inpatient, and community samples around the world. And it's differentiated from other psychiatric disorders in patients, healthy controls, and DID simulators in both neurophysiological and psychological research. The fact is, in terms of number two, DID is found in prevalence studies around the world, wherever and whenever researchers conduct systematic assessments using validated interviews. It's been reported to be prevalent in Canada, Germany, Israel, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Turkey, and the United States. There's one prospective study that assessed the treatment outcome of 232 DID patients from around the world. And these included including the countries Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Israel, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Singapore, Slovakia, South Africa, Sweden, Taiwan, and the US, which includes every continent but Antarctica. There has been systematic search of published peer-reviewed DID studies between the years 2005 and 2013 that have yielded 340 articles. 70 studies included DID patients and were conducted by authors from 48 institutions in 16 countries. It's hardly just diagnosed in North America by just experts. If anything, DID is severely underdiagnosed, and it's typical that people who meet criteria for DID have been treated in the mental health systems for, on average, 6 to 12 years before they are correctly diagnosed with DID. And studies in Australia, China, and Turkey, as well as the US, have shown that it is commonly misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. In one study, 2% of 150 consecutive patients were diagnosed with DID using structured interview. Although 12% in one study were assessed to have one of the dissociative disorders, only 5% of these dissociative patients had been diagnosed previously with any dissociative disorder. And sometimes even though it has been identified with a structured interview, it fails to make it into the medical record. So all in all, it suggests that DID and dissociative disorders in general are underdiagnosed. And why is this? It's thought to be mostly a lack of training, along with skepticism about dissociative disorders. That seems to contribute to the not only the under recognition, but the delayed diagnosis. And studies in Puerto Rico, the United States, Northern Ireland, and Australia all show that clinicians often misdiagnose DID and have generally received little or no training about DID. Clinicians' skepticism was shown to increase as knowledge about DID decreased. And it didn't matter based on the clinician's age or professional degree or years of experience. These were not associated with accurate diagnosis. And unfortunately, one study found that psychiatrists did worse than psychologists in terms of making accurate diagnoses. Accurate diagnoses were often made by those who had treated DID before and who were not skeptical about the disorder. Whether they were accurate or not, clinicians were equally confident in the veracity of their diagnosis. So it's important to be open to being wrong. But displays of skepticism by clinicians, which discourages openness in patients already embarrassed by their symptoms, may contribute to the problem. DID is not rare. In a prospective treatment outcome study of DID with 292 therapists, the majority of who were not DID experts, 11% of patients treated in the community had borderline personality disorder, and in addition to comorbid DID. Yet none of these therapists were DID experts. We do see that these myths are in fact myths. In terms of it being iatrogenic, there is now overwhelming evidence that DID is a complex post-traumatic developmental disorder, and it is not simply based on fantasy or suggestion or sociocultural. And there is an enormous amount of neuroimaging studies that is of great interest that I go over in the course that shows very distinct circuitry that's unique to different ego states or alters, and it cannot be mimicked. They have paid professional actors who could not mimic what happens in the brains of people with DID. In terms of treatment being harmful, there have been a number of case series and inpatient treatment studies that demonstrate that, in fact, treatment for DID is helpful rather than harmful across a wide range of clinical outcome measures. One meta-analysis of 8 treatment outcome studies for any dissociative disorder yielded moderate to strong within-patient effect sizes for dissociative disorder treatment. Most importantly, the treatment of patients with dissociative disorders, or TOP-DD study, is the large prospective treatment study by Brand and colleagues. They used a naturalistic design to collect data from 230 DID patients, as well as 50 patients with dissociative disorder NOS and their treating clinicians. And over 30 months of treatment, and this is a long-term process, patients showed decreases in dissociative, PTSD, and depressive symptoms, as well as decreases in hospitalizations, self-harm, and physical pain. Clinicians reported that patient functioning increased significantly over time, as did their social, volunteer, and academic involvement. This slide shows basically the place that dissociation has had in all of the DSM manuals across time, starting with the number 1 in 1952, the year before I was born, where they had psychoneurotic disorder and dissociative reaction. Everything was neuroses back in 1 and 2. In DSM-2, it was hysterical neurosis, dissociative type, which is what Freud and Breuer wrote about in the seduction hypothesis, which was later denied and retracted. And then in 1980, the term multiple personality disorder came along, and it was then changed to dissociative identity disorder in 94. And again, it persisted in 2013. So there's been some element of dissociation, some recognition of the phenomenology of dissociation throughout the history of psychiatry, and including American psychiatry and the DSM. Again, dissociative disorders have been reported in every continent in the world except Antarctica. That's pretty impressive. It is not just an American thing or a North American thing, like many people think. In terms of the prevalence, now this may blow your mind because I know it does a lot of people. The latest prevalence data show that DID, this is current annual prevalence, is approximately 1.5%. And if you don't believe me, get out your DSM-5s and look in the dissociative disorders or dissociative identity disorder section, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And that's what the prevalence data are showing, that DID is on the order of 1 to 1.5% current prevalence, not lifetime prevalence. And it's more common than schizophrenia. It's more common than anorexia nervosa. It's more common than obsessive compulsive disorder. And these are not thought to be extremely rare disorders, are they? These disorders have been largely ignored. All of the major surveys and epidemiological studies that have been done in this country, starting with the National Catchment Area Study and the National Comorbidity Survey and the National Comorbidity Survey Replication and the NESARC studies, and every epidemiological study done in the United States has not asked about dissociation, much less dissociative identity disorder. It has been invisible to psychiatry. It has been ignored to psychiatry until more recently. Some of the research has now emerged to show that it is a real and very serious disorder. So I want to transition now to talking a little bit about treatment of DID and eating disorder at Montanito and Affiliates, where we've been doing some research, and I act as a director of clinical outcomes and research. And over the last 4-year period, we've identified 13 adults with DSM-5 defined DID. Most of them were treated in residential care, 9 of them, 3 in partial hospital program, and 1 in intensive outpatient. 11 of the 13 completed admission assessments. 1 patient left after day 1, and another declined to complete the surveys. 9 of the 11 who filled out admission surveys assessments also completed discharge assessments. The mean age was 29. Range 18 to 47. Mean BMI was 31.8 with a large range from anorexia nervosa territory of 17 all the way up to 71.1 extreme obesity. The mean length of the first stay, some had multiple admissions, and I'm just showing one of their admissions, is 46 days with a fairly wide range all the way up to 90. Their life events checklist 5 score, which is a measure of criterion A, was on average 12.6. That means they endorse on average nearly 13 different types of traumas in their lives, and it ranges anywhere from 3 to 22. So we see people who remember and have endorsed an enormous amount of trauma in their life, and then others who are probably earlier in their stage of recovery and treatment who remember some but not all of their traumas, but given that wide range. The average that we see in non-DID people with PTSD is about 8. We looked at the Eating Disorder Inventory 2 total scores versus their PTSD symptom checklist 5 total scores. This is a measure of PTSD symptoms, and there is a significant correlation between eating disorder and PTSD symptoms, significant. When we look how this changes, the EDI-2 total score from admission to discharge in 9 of these patients who had both DID and eating disorder, we see a significant improvement, 0.02. We see the same kind of evidence of improvement using the Eating Disorder Examination Questionnaire global score. So again, they're better off after treatment at discharge, having received residential care that focuses on their eating disorder, their DID, as well as other comorbidities. We see the same pattern for the PHQ-9, which is a measure of depression, major depressive symptoms, significant improvement over the course of treatment. We see an improvement in actual PTSD symptoms. This is the PCL-5 total score. Now, this just failed to reach significance, 056. Looking at the data, there's one case in particular that did get worse. And those of you who treat people who are severely traumatized, who have just PTSD, much less DID, sometimes people's symptoms do get worse before they get better. We see a nice trend going in the right direction. And perhaps with more patients, the analysis will become significant. When we look at the change score, the change in the eating disorder inventory 2 total score between admission and discharge, and the change score for the trauma symptoms, we see a highly significant correlation. Same thing with the EDEQ global score. The change in the eating disorder symptoms is correlated to the change in the PTSD symptoms. Similarly, we see the same thing with, trauma symptoms get better, eating disorder, PTSD symptoms get better. Same with anxiety. This is the Spielberger state trait anxiety state score, highly correlated, and this is the trait score. Again, we see a very significant correlation between the two. You can see this one case to the far left at the bottom. That's the one that's getting worse, that's not getting better. And that does happen in the course of treating severe trauma. So this is a positive proof of concept data that DID and eating disorder together can be successfully treated in a specially trauma-informed program at higher levels of care. That integrated treatment of eating disorder symptoms and trauma-related symptoms can facilitate stage 1 stabilization and begin stage 2 work, which is the trauma work proper. That improvement of eating disorder, depressive, and state trait anxiety symptoms is strongly correlated with improvement in PTSD symptoms in patients with DID-ED following residential eating disorder treatment. I want to share with you a clinical vignette of one of these cases, one of these 9 cases. She's a 50-year-old white female social worker and married mother of 2 daughters. She has a history of childhood traumas, subsequent eating disorder, depression, PTSD, and DID diagnosed in 2012. And yes, you can have both PTSD and DID simultaneously. She had a history of significant self-harm to the point of having multiple sutures and second-degree burns, multiple suicide attempts via overdose and hanging, most recent in 2015, requiring medical and psychiatric hospitalization. She recently stepped down to partial hospital after 9 weeks in residential treatment. Her eating disorder began at age 8 when her mother, who had a psychotic disorder and alcohol use disorder, would tell her she put glass and poison in her food. So, of course, she feared food, would restrict, and then binge and purge when her mom was not around. She continued to binge and purge throughout childhood and adulthood until her first eating disorder treatment well into adulthood after her second pregnancy. For the past 16 years since beginning eating disorder treatment, she hasn't binged or purged, but she continued to restrict and ruminate on food labels and struggle with her body image, not having any mirrors in her home. Her eating disorder was driven by feeling in control when restricting and out of control when eating. She fears food is poisoned, which she understands is irrational and based on trauma history. Her weight has fluctuated tremendously between 115 pounds and 285 pounds during her adulthood, and she's 5'4" tall. Her current BMI is 34. She's had multiple childhood traumas, including sexual abuse by her father, ages 8 to 12, and her mother was a high-end prostitute who would bring her to participate when young. She's been in multiple treatment programs and levels of care to address her mental disorders, and repeatedly told by eating disorder and mood programs that she needed to transfer to trauma program, but trauma programs would not take her due to her active eating disorder, the proverbial catch-22. She reported that her experience at Montanito residential treatment has been, quote, life-changing since her eating disorder, PTSD, and DID were addressed concurrently with an integrated trauma-informed approach and 4 sessions of cognitive processing therapy, which she plans to continue as an outpatient. She has reported feeling over-medicated in the past, becoming dependent on benzodiazepines, which she no longer takes, and says that at Montanito, she felt heard and understood for the first time in treatment. She agreed to the medical recommendations, the medication recommendations, which included Lamictal, which she had previously avoided due to lack of trust, and she now no longer experiences suicidal thoughts, which she had for years, and is now very hopeful about her future. A little bit about the guidelines. These are the guidelines from the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation for treating DID, 3rd edition. The last ones were published in 2011. They actually are working on 4th revision, but they are not done or out yet. But the consensus is that complex trauma-related disorders, including DID, were most appropriately treated in sequenced stages. I referred to the staging earlier. And this was noted as early as the late 19th century by Pierre Janet, who advocated a phase-oriented approach. The most common structure includes stage 1, establishing safety, stabilization, and symptom reduction; 2, confronting, working through, and integrating traumatic memories; and 3, identity integration and rehabilitation. And this, of course, takes place over months to years. Stage 1, again, focuses on this symptom stabilization and safety, including enhanced control over symptoms. And when we're talking about eating disorders, we, of course, are talking about getting a handle on binging, purging, and restricting, as well as compulsive exercising, maybe diet pill abuse, as well as psychoeducation about the treatment and trauma-related disorders, and establishing collaborative relationship. Understanding the adaptive function of these symptoms, that self-injury, suicidality, are often attempts to regulate emotion and maybe reenactments of the trauma. And the eating disorder symptoms is the same thing. And you can see in this case that I shared with you how it's a reenactment of the kinds of abuse she sustained by her mother. We teach skills to manage affect and impulses, such as DBT skills, for example, as well as to understand and cooperate with dissociated self states. The failure to stabilize the patient, or a premature focus, and this is a mistake a lot of young therapists, inexperienced therapists make, the premature focus on detailed exploration of traumatic memories usually results in deterioration in functioning and a diminished sense of safety. Stage 2 then embraces confronting this traumatic material by developing a narrative of non-traumatic and traumatic experiences, resolving these distortions and increasing mastery over the memories. It's explored like you do in prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy session after session, but it's kind of paced more, and they're given more time to understand and integrate their traumatic recollections with continued emphasis on stage 1 and grounding skills and containment between therapy. So this allows them to maintain function while doing this very, very difficult work. And then stage 3, which one gradually moves into, is about reconnecting with oneself, with others, with current daily life, achieving more solid and stable sense of self and relationships with others and to the outside world. There may be continued fusing of alternate identities and moving toward full integration. So there's less fragmentation, greater sense of calm, resilience, internal peace, a more coherent sense of one's past history, and ability to deal in the here and now with more effectively with current problems. If you're interested in the course, again, 5 CMEs, you can go to sharpenminds.com. It's the one in the middle of your screen, sharpenminds.com / that's where the course, the integration of Sylvia the Wood Nymph, which I've described to you. And you can read about it, see what other people have said about it who've been in the course. And when you scroll down, pre-register, where it says pre-register for the 5-hour course here, click on that. And those of you who attended the webinar tonight can have a 20% discount. It's only $125 and you get 25% off of that, but you have to use the code Sylvia20. Sylvia20. We're also doing a documentary film, Sylvia's life, but also DID and childhood sexual abuse. And we've got a number of major experts, as well as Sylvia's husband and friends who have been interviewed. And I want to show you a clip of that documentary. And if you want to learn more about the documentary, you can go to sylviadoc.com, sylviadoc.com, as in Sylvia Documentary. And I'm going to show you now a 10-minute trailer of the documentary.
This area is the backyard that used to be the woods that Sylvia had. She always called herself the wood nymph because she lived in the woods.
When I pressed for answers to questions about her history, suddenly Sylvia completely changed her posture, her facial expression, and her voice, and said with the intonation and countenance of a child, "Why don't you just leave us all alone?" How many of you are there? Who am I talking to? Because I knew in that moment I had met my first case of multiple personality.
Of early severe child maltreatment, typically by a parent or somebody close. You're sort of born as a multiple, and the job of your parents is to put you together as a unified individual.
She asked me if she could bring Janie out, and that was the first time.
She wasn't allowed in the house as a kid. They fed her on the back porch in a bowl.
To look at this material and even 30 years later, to know what she went through and to know what so many children go through.
I think people are resistant to think about and talk about and acknowledge how common childhood trauma is because it's a very uncomfortable topic. Like to think that little children are being betrayed and abused, and nobody wants to think it's happening as often as it is.
The metaphor for trauma over and over again in multiples is the broken mirror, with the fragments of the person being reflected in it, as if they were whole and then the trauma breaks. My position is everybody's multiple. Some people are better integrated.
She could never get over the abuse. She always searched for that love, and she could never understand exactly why her mother didn't love her.
She was always present, but she brought the others out, and then she flipped. It was like a blink of an eye.
You want to talk to her? Go ahead. Don't act like I'm stopping you. I'm not. Don't act like it's my fault. I didn't cause the kid to get poor and pitiful. I'm sorry she was poor and pitiful, but I would like her just to be like a little broken dog to get out of my life.
December 1st, 1988, with Deanna. And you can see how Deanna resists going further into talking to little Sylvia.
I'm not the one that ran over with Sylvia. I'm not the one that molested her, and I'm not the one that starved her to death. I feel sorry as hell for her. I really do. I really do. My problem. It brought that on her. I wasn't even born back. You want to talk to her, John? No, then I'll go away. I understand. Still away. Go talk to her, Michelle. You know, the bad thing about it is little Sylvia doesn't even realize how damn pitiful she is. She doesn't even realize it. Well, she thinks she is. I know she's not. She thinks she is. I mean, she thinks that that's her place in life. Literally to be pissed off because that's what Uncle Larry did.
They're still grappling with understanding it and understanding themselves and how all this came to be.
Bye.
Little Sylvia, little Sylvia, little Sylvia. Hello.
She needed to talk about the trauma, and she needed to be given a safe space to talk about what her real experience was.
They weren't helping you grow up. They were lying to you. They were hurting their own pleasure, man. I know it's hard for you. You're not bad. They are.
Think that it's always their fault when they're abused as children. And Sylvia was no exception.
How are you, man? I'm hurt her help.
It was absolutely necessary to identify and talk to all of the parts because they're all part of Sylvia. They're all part of the whole. They're just fragmented.
She had very little clothes, if any, when she was growing up. The railroad people was coming by and they saw her out there and they reported it.
Those are the kinds of abuses that Sylvia the Woodnymph sustained throughout her early childhood.
I'm going to read the quote directly that we talked about earlier, just to get. So this is on your NPR. Interviewer McHugh says, "We say DID does exist, but exists as an artifact, and an artifact being generated and supported by these enthusiasts in the same way Sybil existed as an artifactual product of criminal war." So what would you say to McHugh's to that? Like they sound like they're acknowledging that DID does exist, yet it's an artifact.
So the point he's trying to make there is that some people, some patients believe they have DID and they will talk about it that way, but that it's not a genuine real disorder, that it's been suggested to them, they begin to believe it, they begin to act it out. And I would say, Dr. McHugh, I'd like you to read the research and see that we can distinguish genuine DID looks like in brain research and psychological testing. And perhaps you're not aware of where the research has gone in the last 15, 20 years. 1 out of 4 girls has some kind of sexual experience, unwanted sexual molestation or experience happen before they're 18.
Why do you think I couldn't do my study at NIH? I had to go get my money outside. Here I'm at a place where they shoveled money at people and they wouldn't let me have any dollars for this. And then I couldn't do it on campus. Partly there was a prejudice against the people. I mean, my boss basically said, I don't want those people in my building. You know, we're talking about little girls who were sexually abused. I mean, it was horrifying. So there was some of that stigma that went with it. I think there's also a mutual element here. I think there are people up there who don't want child abuse.
There are people who have things to hide, who would rather not have this looked at and talked about and recognized as common.
Naked, red-headed girl running wild in the woods. I was the wood nymph. She named herself that.
Here's the websites again. And if you want more information about dissociative disorders, you can go to the website of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. Basically,
Dr. Brewerton, we can't see your slides.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you'll just hit share screen again, you may need to do that.
Okay, hold on.
Or just switch back from the video to your PowerPoint, probably.
You see the?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are the websites again for the documentary and the course and the discount code. Sylvia, sorry for those interruptions. I was trying to look at the questions and it kept stopping the video. So I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm gonna just start at the top. Has your experience been primarily with DID patients who have distinct alters that are unaware of each other, or also with those on a spectrum, including more DID, not NOS diagnosis? Both. I've had experience with both. Once I developed a reputation for having an interest in this, and I was an inpatient attending psychiatrist at the Institute of Psychiatry for 8 years, they would send them all to me. And we also saw a lot of them in our eating disorder program. Once we started becoming sensitized to the issue of trauma and started asking about it, I think you find what you didn't see before. And so we saw, and I have seen people, probably seen 40 or 50 people with full-on DID, and I've seen many cases with DID or dissociative disorder NOS. I've seen dissociative amnesia. I've certainly seen depersonalization, derealization disorder, and I've seen PTSD, dissociative subtype. And I think it's really an important advance to the field that the DSM-5 added the dissociative subtype of DID. Is it possible that a patient could fake DID? Yes, of course. It's possible to fake any psychiatric disorder. Have I experienced this? No, I actually have not. Usually it's the opposite. And when somebody comes in to you and is waving a big red flag and saying, I'm DID, that's a red flag. Most people with real DID, unless they've been diagnosed before, don't know that they have DID. You have to persuade them that they have DID, much like, treating someone who doesn't know that they're depressed or doesn't know they have schizophrenia or doesn't know that they have OCD and doesn't really want to know. You have to make the diagnosis, develop an alliance, persuade them that you know what you're talking about and that this is a real disorder. It's like a lot of things in psychiatry that, you have to kind of make the diagnosis and use your powers of persuasion to teach them. It doesn't make them any less of a person, and that this is treatable, and it doesn't make them a bad person. And how would I know? Well, I do structure every case that I look at with DID or possible DID, and this is what I tell everybody, and you'll see in the course. I recommend that they do a structured interview. I recommend the one that's available readily is the Dissociative Disorder Interview Schedule for DSM-5 by Colin Ross, and to go through that carefully with the patient. And then you will get the endorsement of the symptoms. And then furthermore, it's really helpful, just as you do in good practice, to get third-party documentation that these kinds of switches have been observed by people in their family or their roommates or workers or friends or what have you. And so getting that kind of third-party verification that these kinds of ego state alterations occur when you're not looking and is very helpful and validating. Have I seen a significant connection and overlapping symptoms between DID and FND. FND. I'm not really sure what FND really is, to tell you the truth. I'm blocking on that. FND. If you could spell that out, Allison, I would appreciate it. There's still people who don't believe in Bruce. There's still people who don't believe that mental illness is real. They don't believe that anorexia nervosa is real. They don't believe that schizophrenia is real. There are deniers and naysayers out there. There are people who don't think child abuse is really a big deal. There are people who don't believe people who report childhood rape. There are naysayers in the world, and even when you have objective evidence for the existence of a phenomenon, doesn't mean people are going to accept it. So, we just have to kind of march ahead and use the evidence. Do we know from a neurobiological perspective what causes the compartmentalization? Take my course. I discuss that in depth, and there are many, many articles about that published, looking at the kind of circuits. It's basically a matter of circuitry that corresponds to the compartmentalization and the amnesia of alters. And this circuitry has been shown initially with EEG, quantitative EEG, SPECT scanning, which measures blood flow, as well as functional MRI and PET scanning. They've all been done and show the same kind of distinct in circuitry in the brain that corresponds to the alters. What are my thoughts on a person with DID on a long-term ketogenic diet incorporating intermittent fasting? I wouldn't do that. I don't know why I would even think about doing that. This is a trauma-based disorder, and you need trauma-focused treatment. And I think all of the research shows that trauma-based disorders need trauma-focused treatment. Now, maybe the ketogenic diet could be somehow adjunctive if they had severe obesity, but intermittent fasting, definitely not. That is basically promoting an eating disorder or eating disordered behaviors. And if someone is at risk, and people with DID and trauma are, I would not prescribe that. Lisa Mandel, I have a client with DID and I worked together for a little over a year now. I've met over 20 alters and there are far more. The client says there are over 200 in their system. This client has changed my life. I wonder what you would do if working with a client like mine who has no interest in integration, who just wants to improve the communication between the alter. Oh, wow. Well, I would keep chipping away at it, and I would ask why. A lot of Socratic questioning. That's the essence of good psychotherapy. It's the essence of cognitive therapy. It's the essence of cognitive processing therapy, is to use a lot of Socratic questioning and peeling off the layers and asking why. And I think reassurance, because often alters think that you want to annihilate them. They fear death. They have their own kind of existential anxiety that they're going to be dispensed with, and they're all essential. That's one message that's important to give to all of the parts of the system. All of the parts are absolutely necessary. All of the parts will still be there with integration. It's not at all about exercising any parts or exercising or getting rid of or killing off any parts. That is wrong, and that is not going to be helpful. So am I taking new clients with DID? No, I'm sorry. I'm retiring from my clinical practice. Of Sylvia, that loved her abusive parents and that needed to be worked with and integrated. Absolutely. Sylvia loved her mother till it was amazing to me, the kind of love and forgiveness. She was a very devout Christian. She loved her mother, who was probably had a psychotic illness, was probably chronically schizophrenic herself and mentally retarded, developmentally delayed. And she loved her and took care of her when she became demented later in her life, took her into her home, took incredible care of her. I was always amazed and admired her for her ability to love. And even though she didn't deny what her mother did to her. So thank you, Jessica. What was the end outcome of Sylvia's therapy? You'll find out in the course, but she became completely integrated. She met the man that you saw in the trailer. That was Don, her husband. They spent 25 years of really happy existence together. She remained integrated and united, and it was a very happy outcome. And that's part of the message, that she wanted to deliver to the world and wanted me to deliver to the world and what I want to deliver to the world, that this is a real illness and it's very treatable and people can recover. Is it possible for alters to go into hiding? Absolutely. Happens all the time. Absolutely does. That these incidents of abuse are linked to sexual trafficking that is so prevalent. Absolutely. Absolutely, it's linked to sexual trafficking and prostitution. And one of Sylvia's alters, and earlier in her life, she was a prostitute, and that's how she was, didn't have extensive education, and she was a very attractive young woman. And usually within the system, there's an alter or part that masters the sexuality and may even like it, and you get that with these kinds of pathological attachments with early childhood sexual abuse, particularly incestuous, that the people who are supposed to love you or are having sex with you, and it's very, very, very confusing. So yeah, that kind of repetition compulsion continues on. Do DID patients have confabulatory memories, thinking they did something they did not, even if it is a small daily function like do an entire project at school that they actually did not complete? That's certainly possible. And one has to be very, very careful about what you suggest, to just be very present and to let them lead the way and not implant anything, because false memories do happen. It's just not the full story about DID. And the people who are most susceptible to false memories are people who are already dissociative. They're the ones who are already very suggestible and amenable to bad therapy. Just like schizophrenia can get worse with bad therapy, depression, anorexia, bulimia, OCD, every illness can get worse or bad, or even emerge with bad. I think a lot of times that does happen, or certainly has happened in treating DID, when people inadvertently facilitate or reinforce the compartmentalization. Curious if you have used what Dr. Greenblatt would call integrative medicine approaches in this work with DID folks. I just met Dr. Greenblatt this year, and even though I'm familiar with integrative medicine approaches, again, I'm a clinical researcher. I use evidence-based treatment whenever I can. And then my clinical experience tells me, and also what are willing and interested in doing. So that's the three-legged stool of evidence-based treatment. It's what does the research say? What does my clinical experience tell me that works? And what does the patient want? And what are they willing to do? And so, yeah, if there are certain integrative medicine approaches, I will use anything and everything as an adjunct, but I think it doesn't substitute for the kind of guideline-based treatment of DID that I think needs to occur for people to really recover, and for their eating disorder as well in this case. The client has been doing this herself. This is not being suggested as a treatment. The keto diet. She strongly believes it helps her and does it with her partner. Well, if she's willing to do it and wants to do it, I don't have a problem with it. It's just, in my experience, the keto diet is very difficult to sustain. So if you want to contact me for a consultation about this, I'm happy to do that. What are my thoughts about a person having varying diagnosis associated with each personality? Yes, sometimes there are behaviors that are contained within the personality constructs or the alter. For example, there may be one or more alters who restrict, or one or more alters who purge, or do other kinds of behaviors that would be considered pathological. Gambling, substance abuse, OC symptoms, absolutely. So a lot of times and again, it's kind of what is the function, what is the adaptive function of these in terms of the trauma. And I think once you kind of see the bigger picture, one can understand these behaviors within these different ego states and why they're there and how they emerge. And then that can often lead to how you can help them recover from it. Did Sylvia's mother ever apologize to her? Yes, but in a kind of global way. If I ever did anything to hurt you, I'm sorry. But had no real memory of a lot of the or specific acknowledgement of some of the specific horrific that she did to Sylvia. But in a generalized way, she did. do you think patients with DID experience have trauma before age 4? Or could the primary trauma occur at a later age as an adult, for an example? So all of the major experts in the DID field, and that was Frank Putnam on the film, by the way. Frank Putnam has been one of my major teachers and mentors. I mentioned him earlier, and that was Bethany Brand also, who is in the trailer. All of the major experts in DID say that the trauma must have occurred sometime before the age of 6, more or less that age, and give or take a little bit based on developmental age. But chronological age, it's, probably before preschool. And could the primary trauma occur at a later age and produce DID? There's less of a chance of that. You can certainly produce dissociation and dissociative symptoms and dissociative PTSD, for example, but actual DID, it seems to need to occur at a younger time of development where the ego is less formed. Ego state identity is much less formed. But what is my perspective on using internal family systems therapy for DID? I'm leery. I'm not trained in internal family systems therapy. I'm leery of it for DID because I think it promotes the idea that we all have parts, and not that we don't. But my concern about IFS is that it will reinforce the splitting rather than giving the message of unification and integration, and that we're all part of the whole. And so I think if you're really good and know what you're doing, that those concepts can be helpful. I had a lot of training in family therapy, in structural family therapy, and my family therapy training helped me in dealing with Sylvia. So I could think in systems. I also studied biological systems. So for me, it was helpful to know about systems. But I can't really comment beyond that in terms of IFS. Again, there is no clinical data about using IFS therapy for DID. There's no controlled trials for IFS in PTSD, believe it or not, yet. It may very well work, but it hasn't really been shown to work, even though I know a lot of people really sing its praises. How common is it for different parts to correlate with different physiological states? Absolutely. I worked with a patient who had a complicated hospital course because of this. She was admitted for physical illness. Absolutely. The entire body, the entire physiology, not just the brain circuits, but the entire neurophysiology and autonomic nervous system can change with altered identity, heart rate, for sure. One of the most amazing things that is still unexplained is how different alters will have different responses to pharmacological agents. They will have different responses to allergens. And one of the things that I observed with my very eyes is whenever Diana, which was one of Sylvia's alters, would come out, she would develop a rash to the gold jewelry that she was wearing. And I would see the rash develop right before my eyes when Diana would come out. Within minutes, she would start itching and start having to take off her gold jewelry. And I could see the rash. And there was no way to fake that. And then Sylvia would come back, the host Sylvia, and she would see her jewelry there, and she would know that Diana was there. And that would kind of give it away because she had no memory that Diana had been present. So you do get these kinds of major alterations in physiology, different ego states. And there were two kinds of hysteria back in the days of Freud. There was dissociative hysteria, which was really referring to multiplicity. And then there was conversion hysteria, which was really referring to somatic symptoms manifesting as in Freud's that came out of trauma, and which we call somatoform symptom disorders, which we called somatization in DSM-4. That is also very much linked to histories of early childhood sexual abuse. And so you can get all kinds of symptoms that are state dependent. And I want to also, before I stop, put a plug in for Frank Putnam's newer book called The Way We Are. And this came out 2 or 3 years ago. And it's a major compilation of the research to date about states of mind and the regulation or dysregulation of states of mind. It's really superb piece of work. And, I think those of you who are asking these questions might find this very, very interesting to learn more about states of mind, because we all have states of mind. Babies have different states, and they're learning how to regulate their states as we grow and mature. So there's a whole science about that, and we see it mostly disturbed. We see emotional dysregulation as part of a lot of psychiatric disorders, and particularly those that are trauma linked or trauma related. And DID is kind of the poster child of kind of dysregulated states. Have I seen a significant connection and overlapping symptoms? FND, I still don't know what FND is.
So Allison said it's functional neurological disorder.
Functional neurological disorder. Yes, absolutely. It's what we used to call somatization or pseudo seizures. Absolutely. Yes, I have. And I've seen a number of those cases, and they're very treatable. Once you can help people identify, not think they're crazy, not be treated like they're crazy or crocs, help them work through their traumas. And yes, many staff in state hospital facilities have difficulty with patients like Sylvia. What education, training, trauma focus would you recommend to reduce usage of restraints? Oh boy. There are a lot of studies that are done in state hospitals that show there are an inordinate number of cases that actually have DID, and they're misdiagnosed as schizophrenia or severe chronic bipolar or chronic psychotic disorders. And I go over a lot of that data in the course. So what educational training? Oh my God, where do I start? I think just training about trauma and its effects, and how to treat people in a trauma-informed way. There's a whole explosion about trauma-informed care, not only in mental health and behavioral health facilities, but in schools and police forces and corporations. And so trauma-informed care is just being aware of the ubiquitousness and universality of traumatic experiences, and having empathy and treating people with respect. And so that's a tall order there, Mercedes. So I think I'm fresh out of questions. I hope I've answered them satisfactorily. I really appreciate you guys and gals hanging out with me tonight and learning something about this. And I invite you again to check out the course. Use the discount code Sylvia20. Check out sylviadoc.com. We're working on this great documentary, and there's a lot more, besides what you saw tonight. You just got a really good taste of it. So thanks again. It's been my pleasure, and feel free to contact me offline if you have any further comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brewerton. That was a great presentation, and nothing like we've just not had anything on this topic before, so I know people were very interested in it. I think they got a lot out of it.
I appreciate the interest.
Absolutely. And again, everyone, I will email you tomorrow with the course details, including the discount code again. And the recording of this webinar will be available on our website within the next few days. And that will be on our webinar page under archived webinars. And thanks again for joining us, everyone.